said at the outset last week that Willie Nelson's theme song, On the Road Again, could be a subtitle for Mark's Gospel, because everything takes place on the road. In the opening pages of that Gospel, Jesus is out searching for John the Baptist, finds him and is baptized, and immediately begins the process on his way back home of recruiting disciples, beginning with 4 fishermen who walk away from their boats. He then, with his disciples, begins traveling from town to town and village to village in the northern part of the country, and then moving steadily south toward Jerusalem. The road from Nazareth to Jerusalem is 65 or 70 miles long, and about halfway there is what your map will tell you is the Sea of Galilee. Locally, it's Lake Gennesaret. We said last week that Lake Gennesaret, surrounded by mountains, very shallow, is subject to severe storms. The wind blows down through the valley to the water. And so in our gospel last week, Jesus is asleep on his boat, whoever the boat belonged to, and the disciples are all crowded in, going back from the Gentile side of the lake to the Jewish side of the lake. A great storm comes up. The disciples become frightened by the high waves and the high wind. They finally wake Jesus with the statement to him, "Don't you care that we are about to perish?" And Jesus says to the wind, "Be still," and to the waves, "Be calm," and all is well. And as they get to the other side, the disciples among themselves are saying, "Who is this? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey his commands?" Who is this? That will be the question that will constantly be with us through these next few Sundays, because what Mark is trying to do is to give pictures of Jesus at work so that you can come to a conclusion of who you believe him to be. The boat arrives at the other side of the lake, the Jewish side. There's a village there. And the story from this morning's gospel unfolds. He no sooner gets on shore than a leader of this local synagogue, someone who would be equivalent, say, to our senior warden, encounters him almost in tears, begging him to come to his house because his daughter is gravely ill. And so the story begins to unfold. For the man to act in such a way, to throw himself at Jesus' feet, to beg for the life of his child, is uncharacteristic for somebody in his position. He didn't get to be the leader of the synagogue without being prominent, probably somewhat wealthy, at least compared to his neighbors. A leader in the local community, a political person. And to throw himself at an itinerant rabbi's feet, begging for the life of his child, would be almost unheard of. Jesus tells him to get up, that he will go with him to the man's house. The man's name is Jairus. The crowd has formed around him, probably friends, the usual folks who want to see what's going on, the onlookers. They show up at every wreck, any excitement. They start moving towards Jairus' house when all of a sudden, out of the crowd, a woman emerges to touch the hem of his garment. Everything comes to a halt. And he says to his disciples, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" The disciples, in their characteristic response, is, "Look, how many people around you? How can you ask such a stupid question?" Or at least that's the implication. And then he spots her. A woman who is gravely ill, has been, we are told, for 12 years. This is one of those R-rated sermons, by the way, talking about things we don't usually talk about except in private. She has what is known as acute menorrhagia. She has a constant menstrual period and has had it for 12 years. She's exhausted all of the medical help she can find, and she has exhausted all of her resources. For a woman in that condition, with no known medical treatment, there was only one way to behave, and that was to exclude her. She could not join the other women at the morning well to draw water. She could not go in any public place. She could not have sexual relations with her husband, or else he was excluded for 30 days. She was totally isolated, an outcast. No friends, little family contact. She could not even hug her children, or else they would be tainted. It's hard to imagine that in a society we live in with the kind of medical care and sophisticated knowledge that we have. It's primitive. It's primitive. And she throws caution to the wind. She knows that if she is caught touching the hem of his garment, she is permanently out of the community. And she risks it all. And Jesus knows what has happened. He picks her out of the crowd and says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you whole." The word means the same thing. They continue on to Jairus' house. Jesus, along the way, is told that don't bother, the child has died. And he looks at him and says, no, she's only sleeping. And they laugh at him. It is the only place in the New Testament, the only place where Jesus is laughed at. He takes the parents and his 3 closest disciples and friends and enters the house. Tells the girl to get up off of her bed. She opens her eyes, looks around, and gets up. Restores her to her family. And by the way, give her something to eat. She's probably hungry. It's a story within a story. My New Testament professor called it a Markian sandwich. It's the characteristic of only that writer. A story within a story. It's a good story. First of all, I think, do not dismiss desperation. We talk a lot about faith and what constitutes faith and how we're all supposed to grow in faith. Beloved, don't sell desperation short. whatever brings you to your knees is holy. Whatever brings you to asking God's help is sacred. I know it to be true. I stood outside of an operating room for 3 hours waiting, hoping that my son's life would be saved. And I can guarantee you there was not one thing I would not have done or given up or promised in return for that healing. Desperation may very well be the way to faith, so never sell it short. Jesus turns the child over to her family. He chose to have his closest friends with him, along with the mother and the father. It seems to me that what this tells us is that healing, that sense of well-being, that wholeness takes place in family and in larger family. That's why we come here. That's why we come here every Sunday morning. It's to hear the story, to, in our own way, ask for healing, for wholeness. It takes place in family. It's an awful thing to be desperate all by yourself. And the third thing about it is, what he says to the family is, feed them for something to eat. That's the other reason we come here. That little insignificant wafer and that tiny sip of wine is food. It's food for the spirit. And if you're desperate enough, you'll be amply fed. Amen.